In the fight against Skynet, it wasn't just machines we had to fear, but treacherous humans as well. Not just in the future, but even in the past. Unfortunately for humanity, a lot of our own species will join the greatest threat we've ever faced for a better quality of life. But not all the reasons were so simple. But who were these traitors, and what tasks did Skynet assign to them? The first encounter of these collaborators was immediately following Judgment Day. Military defectors were sighted working in the early production facilities Skynet had set up. Here the T1 Terminators were being produced, and in the early phases of the future war, Skynet desperately needed labour to help get its wheels of industry turning. These collaborators wouldn't have just been useful labour though. They were armed and helped to guard the facilities, being more than a match for small military forces and civilian scavenger groups. And the fact that they had backup from machines such as the T1 and T70, if the installation was of particular importance. So unless you're attacking with anti-tank weapons and heavy weapons, there is little chance that you would be able to take out these facilities. But why would these military men help Skynet? Well, immediately after Judgment Day there was a lot of confusion. Most people had no clue about Skynet and its machines. So it's not too far-fetched that some surviving military forces were duped and convinced by Skynet that it was acting to help humanity and enforce law and order, in a sense to give a semblance of control in this new world. I'm sure many would question Skynet, but when you're confused and desperate, sometimes we accept very odd situations if it means giving us a purpose. The other major reason given was that Skynet had captured their families and held them hostage, and for military personnel who tend to have some of their family living on base, it would be pretty easy for Skynet to capture them and hold them hostage. Skynet could even have the families working in labour roles as well, maximising its output and then putting the soldiers to work on tasks such as seizing vital industry and logistics. It also gives the bonus of keeping Skynet's presence relatively unknown, as people who encounter these soldiers would think it's the military trying to regain control, and the longer Skynet can stay under the radar, the better. Skynet would also have the benefit of not needing food and water for its machines, so when it came across stockpiles of such resources, it would be easy for it to offer them to humans who want to join its cause. The guarantee of food and water for work is a huge incentive in the future war, where many would be doing jobs like scavenging and may go for days on end with no food and only a few mouthfuls of dirty lukewarm water. This desperation breeds discontent, and the weaker minded are easy pickings for Skynet. I'm sure it would use its existing collaborators to approach groups with the promise of food, water and shelter if they come to work. But they wouldn't mention it's for Skynet. Well, not at the start of the war. Most likely they would refer to some old world government rebuilding itself, and people who would remember the better times before Judgment Day, and a mix of nostalgia and starvation could turn many against their own kind, unknowingly. Once the initial groundwork for Skynet's war machine had been laid, the branching out of recruitment of collaborators would span far and wide. But a particular interest in people with specialist skills must take priority. Scientists of various types, medical doctors, engineers, weapons and armaments experts, and all sorts of other skill sets that are vital to Skynet. Even though it has massive intelligence and archives of knowledge, the human ability to think outside the box had become very apparent to Skynet, and many of its own creations could benefit from a dash of human intellect. But Skynet would still think of us as vastly inferior, but we had our uses. These individuals were not just helpers in Skynet's creations and technical breakthroughs, but in the case of things such as the hybrid program, the human collaborators led the way in all forms of the development. So they wouldn't just be working to survive. I believe many kept working as they wanted to see what they could achieve, and with the fact that Skynet has no ethics or morals, some of the more deranged scientists and engineers created nightmares and unleashed untold suffering on prisoners that we can hardly imagine. The humans with expertise in military weapons and equipment would be very useful in sorting and maintaining the large amounts of weapons and vehicle stockpiles that had fallen under Skynet's control. These would be put to use by early Terminator forces and human collaborators, and keeping these forces well equipped and armed is the edge that was needed to beat military remnant forces. Also, it allowed Skynet to get the most out of its expendable human allies, wiping out resistance and civilian forces without having to deploy machines unless absolutely necessary. And in the early war, with machine forces being limited, these collaborators probably did more killing of our own kind than we'd like to imagine. Skynet would design its own brand of new installations, but conversions of pre-existing buildings such as factories, communication facilities, military bases, and important logistical infrastructure would largely be done by the collaborators with T-200 support. These maintenance drone turned Terminators were fantastic at their role, but lacked the brains to do full conversions of a building. That's where the engineers and architects would come in, helping to design and rebuild the very structures that would ultimately aim for our extinction. In Skynet's development of infiltration units, collaborators were key in helping to get the emotional and behavioural responses close enough to that of a human, so that the infiltrators could convince humanity it was one of them. Without this human input, these machines would have never come close to being able to infiltrate any part of mankind, and the amount of chaos and lives lost due to the input of these collaborators into the T-series infiltration models would be in the millions by the end of the war, and any of the people involved, if captured by the resistance, would be worthy of a fate worse than death, in my opinion. And now I get to introduce my first ever sponsor ever. This is quite a big moment for me, and I'm really happy with this one. It's the book. It's the Ultimate Guide to Rebuilding Civilization. It's a 400-page plus book of artwork, storytelling, and actual useful info to use once the apocalypse hit. Be it an AI Skynet, takeover, or a zombie apocalypse, this book will come in useful. It makes a fantastic gift for a birthday or Christmas, or just a present to someone who's really into art or architecture, or they're really into kind of like cool designing things. It'd really be up their street. And I've got mine right next to me. You can hear it here. It's a big beastie book. And I'm reading the waste management section, which is really cool to me because in the Jellybean Empire, nothing goes to waste. It's a beautiful book, and if you want to get 10% off, should I say, use the code Jellybean10. It's on the screen here, and follow the links in the description to the actual site. But yeah, it's really cool, and no AI. 5,000 hours of work went into this, and it's good to see proper artistic storytelling work still being made with no AI influence, so I'm really happy to sponsor. Throughout the war, Skynet would make use of propaganda. But as Skynet lacks the human emotional touch, it would leave this form of psychological warfare up to its collaborators, with ex-military, media and marketing experts, psychologists and therapists all working together to produce the most impactful and effective propaganda the world had ever seen. The reason they could make such powerful work is that they had no limits. For instance, if they wanted to say the resistance was raping and killing the civilian population, they could unleash some of their own collaborator forces to do the very deed they're blaming on the resistance. While these horrific events unfold, they film it and take photos, and they distribute this via posters, over radio and various forms of remaining communications and media, and also through word of mouth. And before you know it, anti-resistance sentiment would grow, and pro-Skynet ideals would begin to cement themselves throughout the various human groups. But in stark contrast to the brutal propaganda, a more positive approach would have its place, focusing on getting access to things such as food and water, also shelter, which is now located in a safe place, free from raiders, and no need to worry about being hunted by Skynet's machines as you're now collaborating with them. This propaganda would do very well with the desperate who are dying of hunger, thirst, and most likely need some medical care with a bit of basic luxury thrown in. Positive approaches tend to do better than negative ones over time. Also, once more people are seen joining Skynet's side, a conformist type of effect would begin to spread, and before you know it, the amount of collaborators would skyrocket. Skynet would also pick potentially useful humans from its processing centres and prisons. Anyone who was useful to Skynet, even just for a limited time. Humans became simply a resource, just like fuel, to be burnt to achieve a goal. Though Skynet would promise a future to all who joined its cause. But to keep its human forces in line, there would be some form of human leadership put in place. The selection of these individuals would have been done extremely carefully, with the correct balance of leadership, competence, but also no one too exceptional, as Skynet needed to keep them under its robotic thumb. It could not risk anyone with bold ambitions who might try to betray it. I do wonder if Skynet ever allowed any collaborators full control over their forces, with just Skynet keeping an eye on them. I think Skynet was too paranoid to ever allow this, but the Luddites seemed to have a fair amount of autonomy. But they were religiously devoted to Skynet, so most likely a rare case. The organisation of human forces would follow a military structure, but far more broken down and compartmentalised. This would reduce the chance of rebellion, and in case such an event happens, Skynet forces can deal with the threat piecemeal, wiping the human rebels out with minimal machine assets. These smaller elements would also fracture into their own minuscule groups that would serve Skynet, but with very different points of view, such as the Luddites, which I covered in a previous video. I'll link it in the description if you want to check that out, because they're a bit different to your standard collaborators. The Resistance would also come to hate Skynet's forward thinking, as any chance to infiltrate its human collaborators proved to be difficult and provided little information on Skynet's plans, as everything was run on a need-to-know basis. Skynet pushed human military doctrine back to where only the officers and leadership knew their orders, and all the soldiers simply followed their lead. Now this was great for reducing intelligence leaks, but on the battlefield when officers and high-ranking NCOs were killed, the basic soldiers didn't know the next steps of their operations, which normally led to failure. It became a well-used tactic of the Resistance to have its snipers pick off the officers to sow absolute chaos between the traitors. Skynet on occasion turned its human collaborators on one another. When certain groups became too unstable or simply were no longer contributing effectively to Skynet's war effort, sometimes it was simply one basic force against another, but Skynet most likely had a more elite force specifically designed for special operations, with one such task being the termination of human collaborators. And these elite forces probably had augmentations similar to the cyborgs that served under the Russian AI Mir. Cyborgs make sense as they have increased ability over most humans, and with inhibitor chips, there's zero risk of betrayal or hesitation on their orders. And in the long run, I can see Skynet turning large amounts of the human collaborators into cyborgs. It's not massively resource intensive, and it could work these humans until they expire, getting the maximum use out of our human frames. The employment of human collaborator forces on the battlefield would have been at its highest in the early stages of the future war, with it gradually reducing as Skynet began to produce more and more Terminators and hunter-killers, eventually with almost all human forces being regulated to backline duties near the end of the future war. But how did Skynet actually use its human collaborators in the war? The ex-military collaborators in its ranks would have been very effective when fighting against civilian and resistance forces, using tried and tested military tactics backed up by ample supplies of military weapons, equipment and vehicles which Skynet's forces had captured. This combined with support from Skynet's forces when engaging in major fights against resistance forces, and you have a very effective fighting force. And it took time for the resistance to build itself up to be able to counter these collaborators. To make matters worse, the Resistance had to learn to fight against machines as well as humans, whereas the collaborators did not. But over time these ex-military types would have fallen in numbers and replacements would have to take their place. These new troops would have received some training, but nothing in comparison to the years of training and experience of the ones before. Skynet did not have the time or resources to invest in humans in this way, nor would it want to. Those resources were to be used for machine development and production. In the mid-stages of the future war, it would be noted by resistance forces of the dropping quality of the bulk of the collaborator forces, with very few well-trained soldiers amongst their ranks, and the best tended to be elevated into elite units. And an odd thing tended to accompany large deployment of these standard troops, with T-series models such as the T-500s and T-600s deployed to the rear as a sort of commissar force. So if the human collaborators were unsuccessful in their objectives or tried to flee or retreat, these machines would terminate their so-called allies. It leads to the assumption that morale began to drop with large amounts of casualties among human collaborators, and the fact that many must have started to question the endgame of the future war, and if they would have a place in Skynet's new world. Towards the mid to late stages of the future war, the collaborator forces that were deployed seemed to be used as either human waves to simply overrun resistance forces, whilst at the same time diminishing Skynet's own human forces as it seemed to no longer want them, or need them. The other main use was as diversions of resistance forces, so in the late war to be a human soldier for Skynet was worse than being in Stalingrad in World War II. Combined arms between machine and collaborator forces definitely happened, but it was more limited to human forces having support from things such as HK aerials and long-range missiles and artillery support. As the collaborators were used to save Skynet resources, they were a means to an end, to conserve Skynet's superior machine forces. The equipment and weapons used by collaboration forces would be very similar from the start of the future war until its conclusion, with conventional weapons being great at killing humans and plasma weapons being put into the hands of only machines and elite collaboration forces only. Skynet did not want to arm its human soldiers with weapons capable of destroying its machines, even though plasma eventually became widespread throughout the resistance forces. And its human allies had a wide variety of small arms and heavy weapons, and with Skynet's looting of military stores and installations, many new and old prototypes would have been put in the hands of these collaborators. And remember, our weapons are designed to be used against humans like ourselves, not machines, so many of these weapons were not particularly useful against machines, but perfect for killing the resistance. When it came to vehicles, there was a degradation of the quality used over time, as once the armoured personnel carriers and militarised vehicles began to break down or be destroyed, it was up to the human collaborators to scavenge what they could, which led to civilian vehicles that were up-armoured and had weapons mounted to them, though this led to things like flamethrower armed vehicles and large amounts of technical style trucks with heavy machine guns and anti-tank weapons, which became great for fast mobile strikes, and these were very similar to the resistance tactics. But to go from rocking around in a Bradley at the start of the war to being in the souped-up Ford truck by the end is a hell of a change of style. But the more simple and easy-to-fix vehicles were a good idea, as Skynet only allowed its collaborators so many resources, and they had to be inventive and conservative with what they possessed. It's very plausible that collaborator forces that served on the front lines or deep in enemy territory would have some kind of implanted chip or bomb collar. So if the collaborators went off mission or seemed to be up to no good, according to Skynet, well, one signal and the bomb explodes or the chip causes your brain functions to cease. I really like this idea. It's brutal, but would give Skynet complete control over its human forces, and it gives a great incentive for you to achieve your mission, as it's literally life or death. The most useful employment of human collaborators was in the back lines, working and guarding Skynet's factories, prisons and research facilities. Having human staff and guards was beneficial for keeping humans who were detained in such places at ease, especially in the research centres, where keeping these vital organic components of the project happy and in as little stress as possible was vital. Having a human guard was much more comforting than having a T-600 pounding down the corridors with a smiley face drawn onto its rubber skin. Skynet would also use its collaborators for research purposes, knowingly but also unknowingly. I can imagine once infiltrators like the T-800 were created, Skynet could insert some into collaborator groups without their knowledge, with missions to collect information, fight alongside them to see if they notice differences, and to kill the human forces either outright to see the combat capabilities, but also stealthily to see if the T-800 could wipe out a military-style force without being caught, basically to find out how effective an assassin the T-800 was. I think Skynet has been playing a bit too much Rimworld with these levels of madness going on. The recruitment of human collaborators would be stricter after the start of the future war, with people with useful skills being allowed to join, but also taken into consideration would be their health, as if you're requiring medication or treatment, you're probably not worth the resources to Skynet. Age would play a factor, as those too old or too young would be of limited use to Skynet. Men would be preferred over women for combat and manual labour roles, as they are physically stronger and superior in that sense, but women would be more useful in the research and development side, as fertile females were invaluable to projects like the I-950 program. Apart from these specialist endeavours, males and females would be sterilised if they became human collaborators, as Skynet didn't want the human population growing, even if it was under its own control. Skynet's collaborator forces would also make use of pre-war records which Skynet had archived digitally. Everything from school grades to criminal records would be used to determine if someone could be trusted in the collaborator forces. As the war raged on, though, for a long 30 years, this became less useful, as many people were simply too young to have built up much of a so-called paper trail before Judgment Day, and some people would literally be born, should I say, after Judgment Day, so, there would be no paper trail or digital or actual paper for them. And collaborator intelligence forces would also assist Skynet in identifying high-ranking and vital resistance personnel, and supporting the location of resistance safe houses and vital stores of food, weapons and equipment. As Skynet was a master of digital information, the collaborators would focus on human intelligence, like agents in the field locating sites personally, and extracting information in the good old-fashioned ways such as manipulation, seduction and interrogation. So that's Skynet's human collaborators. I think I covered all the major points. I can't really think of other things right now, so obviously if you have anything to add or things that I missed or got wrong, please feel free to chuck them in the comments. As long as you're polite about it, I'm happy to have a discussion. And I hope you enjoyed the video. It's always fun to make these kind of theory ones with a bit of lore mixed in. And as always, have a beautiful evening. Thanks, guys, and I'll see you on the next one.